Buddhism is not a religion as such, which is of a different kind of religion, but it is really a different way of looking at religion in general. You might call it a critique of religion. So it's not another religion among so many religions. So this is why Buddhism is not a culture. Buddhism or religion is seen as a process of growth or evolution of the human mind. And it is not a set of rules to obey or to follow the commandments. It is a process of growth and evolution and an effort to solve the problem of existence. So when we are born into this world, we are born ignorant. We don't know why we are born. We only know that we are born, that's all. And from the time we are born, we are frightened, in fear. And it is this fear that makes the infant cry even at the moment of birth. And this fear really is the fear of death. And we are frightened that we might die. So every person who is born, whether human being or animal, we are in the process of dying. We cannot prevent death. So it's the feeling of insecurity. It is this feeling of insecurity that leads people to seek protection. Everyone wants someone to protect. And of course, the child, the infant, is protected by the parents or the elders who are looking after the child. But as we begin to grow and become mature, we begin to realize that even the parents are not able to protect. They are all in the same position. We are all in the same boat. So this is why we begin to feel for others. We are not the only people, or I as an individual is not the only person who is in this state of insecurity. Everyone is. So then people begin to look for someone higher than the normal. This is why the human being conceives of a high power, often called God. And we seek refuge in this God. Now this is the childish, dependent way of thinking. the child thinks in a helpless, dependent way. But as people begin to become more mature, and the power of thinking, the intelligence begins to evolve, people begin to reason out and think. In early times, when people were not able to understand what is going on in the external world, they thought all the natural phenomena were controlled by spirits. Maybe they thought good spirits were doing good things and bad spirits were doing bad things. So the good spirits were called gods and the bad spirits were called the devil. But as the human intellect improved, they began to discover the reasons why things happened in the world. They saw that everything in the world, everything that happens due to the presence of the necessary conditions. And this led to what is called determinism, that people began to understand what determines these various natural occurrences or phenomena. And as people began to understand how things happen, the idea of spirits and gods gradually began to disappear. And human beings began to become more self-reliant. They were able to make machines to do things, and they were able to look after themselves to a great extent. And that is the progress of civilization. To be civilized is to what is called gaining mastery over the universe. So it's not real a mastery over the universe, it's really an effort to adjust oneself to fit in to this changing environment. We are not really changing the environment. We are adjusting ourselves or adapting to the environment. This is how the whole process of evolution took place when the earliest forms of life, which came in the form of plants and animals, that whole evolutionary process was a gradual adaptation to the environment. So we are not really controlling the environment. We are adapting to the environment. When we are cold, we might put on a dress that warms the body. If we cannot walk on a certain kind of floor or ground, we wear shoes. Or if it is raining, we use an umbrella or a coat to cover ourselves. So this is a way of adapting to the environment. We are not really controlling the environment. So as people began to become more and more self-reliant in this way, we began to understand that we can look after ourselves to a great extent. And ultimately, it is the human intelligence that is able to do this adaptation. So now the adaptation, which was earlier a physical adaptation, now turns into a mental adaptation when we begin to adapt using the mind. Now this is why when we look at religion, religion has been also a method of adapting to this environment. Early people, human beings, they prayed to the gods, and that was their religion. They made sacrifices. They did all kinds of rituals and ceremonies, hoping that these gods would help them. But as people became mature, they began to realize that they had to not just pray to gods, but they had to begin to live in a different way. So, what is called ethics got into religion. Moral behavior, avoiding what is bad and destructive to oneself and others, and to begin to think of living in the right way. And they also found that we have a problem, which is that we have emotions. And these emotions tend to carry us along certain paths, which leads to the destructive behavior, the selfish emotions in the form of lust, hate, and the selfish thinking only of ourselves. And they began to realize that it is important to purify the mind if we want to behave in the proper way, because our behavior is based on our thinking. So purification of mind is what is called meditation. And so the mysticism in religion came from this effort to purify the mind. And even the concept of God began to change. In the earlier stages, God was seen as some supernatural power. But when people began to think in terms of good behavior, they began to see God as a judge, someone like a human being who punishes and rewards, and sometimes become angry, and sometimes becomes very kind. All human qualities. But with the coming of the purification of mind, God was seen as a universal intelligence or a universal soul with which we could go and unite. So we began to think in terms of a soul, that every individual has a soul, and that begins to be able to unite with this God. That is mysticism. But there is a stage beyond that. And when it comes to the higher level, we begin to realize that God is simply a human concept. And it is the concept of perfection. One who is perfect in goodness, in wisdom, in powers. God is one who is perfect. So in other words, God becomes the ideal of human perfection. God is the ideal of human perfection that human beings conceive and struggles to realize, to attain to, through the practice of religion. So the whole practice of religion becomes an effort to reach that state of perfection. And in Buddhism, we find that this state of perfection has been realized. And one who realizes this state of perfection is called Buddha. So in other words, Buddha is not just an ordinary human being, not just a philosopher like Socrates or Plato. Buddha is man or woman become God. That is the human being who transcends all human weaknesses and becomes divine or perfect. This is the meaning of a Buddha. Now there is a sutra where some Brahmin during the time of the Buddha, he came to the Buddha and asked a question. He saw the Buddha as a person who is very uncommon, someone very different from the common people. And he asked, are you a deva, a god, some celestial being who has taken a human form? He said, no. Then he asked, then are you a devil who has taken a human form? He said, no. Then are you some kind of angel or some celestial being? Said, no. Then are you a human being? He said, no. So this is very important to understand, that he didn't say he was a human being. And then this man asked, well, you have said no to all my questions. Who are you? And he said, if due to the presence of certain conditions, a person could be called a god, those conditions are not present in me. If due to the presence of certain conditions, a person could be called a devil, those conditions are also not present in me. If due to the presence of certain conditions, a person could be called some kind of celestial being, those conditions are not present in me. If due to the presence of certain conditions, a person could be called a human being, those conditions are also not present in me. And he said, there are three things that are absent in me. Lust, which is called lobha, hate, dosa, and all selfishness or the concept I am as a self, that's absent in me. It is like a lotus that grows up in the water, is born in the water, grows up in the water, rises above the water and stands unsoiled by the water. In the same way, I have been born in the world, grown up in the world, but I have risen above the world and I stand unsoiled by the world. So this is the ultimate level of evolution. In the of life itself. It's the evolution of the human consciousness. And that is why he is called a Buddha. Buddha means one who is awakened. Awakened from sleep. That means the ordinary person is not fully conscious. Although we think we are conscious of a dream, really. And this dream is the dream of existence. Now, to awaken from this dream of existence is to realize that we do not really exist. Our idea of existence itself is an illusion. That's why it's a dream. It's only when we are able to wake up from that dream that we become fully awakened and we become a Buddha. So the ultimate goal of the Buddhist is to reach that state of perfection. So religion, from the Buddhist point of view, is to progress towards that state of perfection. So the practice of religion is a gradual process of evolution of the human consciousness. But it begins, the starting point is to become aware of this state of perfection and desire to reach that. It becomes our goal. It is only when Buddha becomes our goal that we become Buddhists. A Buddhist is a person whose goal has become the Buddha. And in order to attain to that state, we have to appreciate that or value that. Our life, whatever we do today, depends on our sense of values. If I think money is the greatest thing in the world, I'll be doing everything to get money. If I think pleasure, enjoying sensual pleasures is the greatest thing in the world, I'll sacrifice all money to enjoy these sensual pleasures. So it is that sense of values that determines our goal in life. So if we begin to realize that the greatest value in life is to reach that state of perfection, then we begin to go in that direction. So that becomes a reorientation of our life. Our life begins to turn in that direction. So to value this goal, and this goal is the highest good, and to appreciate this highest good and the goodness is what is called Saddha. Saddha. Sat means what is good and true. Dha is to uphold. Uphold goodness. Now we have this common saying, is right is might or might is right. Now if we say might is right, we think might or power is the greatest thing in the world. But if we say right is might, we are saying that goodness is the greatest thing in the world. And all religions have been personifying this goodness and calling this God. And every religion is personifying evil and calling it the devil. So this is very significant. From a Buddhist point of view, God is the personification of goodness, and devil is the personification of evil. These are not spirits or some being somewhere in heaven or hell. So the important thing is to see. I believe that Jesus was saying the same thing. For example, in the Gospels we find Jesus saying, "The Father and I are one." And the Jews take up stones to throw at him. And he says, "I have done a lot of good to you through the Father in me. For which good are you trying to stone me?" And the Jews say, "Well, we are not trying to stone you for any good that you did, but for the blasphemy against God. You being an ordinary man, you claim to be the Son of God. You are insulting God." Then he says, "If you want to know whether I am the Son of God, look at my behavior. I do what my Father does. You are the children of the devil. You do what your father does. You are trying to kill me." That's very clear what he means by God and devil. God is the personification of goodness, and the devil is the personification of evil. That's why sometimes I say Jesus was a Buddhist. God, seen from a Buddhist point of view, is simply this ideal of perfection, which is a human concept. And it is the human being that ultimately is able to reach that state of perfection. And when the human being reaches that state of perfection, he is called Buddha. Buddha himself has identified himself as God become, Brahma Bhuto. The word for God was Brahma. Brahma Bhuto means one who has become Brahma, or one who has become God. So it is incorrect to say that Buddhism is an atheistic religion or philosophy. It's neither theistic nor atheistic. The theist thinks that this God is the creator of the world. That's the difference. Whereas the humanist thinks that this God is man himself in perfect form. So that state of perfection is for the human being to realize. So it is a human potential that has to be actualized. That's what God means. So to be able to appreciate that ideal of perfection is the beginning of the path towards spiritual perfection. That is the meaning of spiritual perfection. All religions speak of uniting with God. What is uniting with God? It is becoming God. Just as a river that flows into the ocean, when it enters the ocean, it becomes the ocean. So in the same way, When a human being unites with God, he becomes God. That is the true union with God. So there is no reason for anyone to think Buddhism is atheistic or that Buddhism is not a religion. It's not correct. There are really two kinds of religions, the theistic and the humanistic. The Western religions like Judaism, Christianity and Islam, they are mainly theistic. It could be polytheistic or monotheistic. It is still theistic. Now, theistic means that God or that perfect person is seen as the creator of the world. That's the problem. And that the human being is seen as a sinner. And the human being can never become perfect like God. The human being can never become equal to God. The human being can only be forgiven by God. And the human being cannot even perfect himself without the help from God. It's a weakness, like the child who is weak. But if we take a religion like Hinduism, they also believe in God. They also believe in a creator of the world. But there is a difference. The difference is that for the Hindu, God is not an outsider there. God is within you. It is your own soul. For the Hindu, you are God, but you have forgotten that you are God. What you have to do is to realize that you are God. And to see the unity of the soul creation. So the highest enlightenment for the Hindu is Aham Brahmasmi, which means I am God. To realize I am God is the greatest enlightenment. But that is a humanistic way of thinking rather than the theistic way of thinking. And when it comes to Buddhism, that God is not seen as a soul that pervades the universe. That's the difference between Hinduism and Buddhism. Even that soul disappears. God is seen only as a human concept, the concept of perfection that the human being struggles to realize. So that's the important thing. So Saddha is when we have understood this and appreciated this, and have seen that all the sufferings of the world can be brought to an end only by adjusting oneself and purifying one's mind and reaching the state of perfection and becoming God. That is seen as the solution to the problem of life. The problem of life is birth, old age, disease, death. Meeting the unpleasant, parting from the pleasant, not being able to satisfy our desires. This is the problem of life. If life was created by God, He has created suffering. That's the Buddha's point of view. But Buddha doesn't believe that it was done by a God, or it's simply, it happens due to the presence of the necessary conditions, the deterministic. And so, the solution has to be found by the human being himself, not by depending on some external supernatural being. That is why it is a humanistic religion.